Hi, welcome back to the Story Lady. Today we'll be reading Lucky Mrs. Ticklefeather by Dorothy Canhart. Mrs. Ticklefeather was a very thin old lady with a good-sized feather in her hat, and on her feet she had tall black shoes with plenty of buttons. She lived on the top floor of a terribly high building. She lived there because the top floor is the best place for getting sunshine, and oh, what a good thing sunshine is for thin old ladies. With Mrs. Ticklefeather lived a lovely big bird called a puffin, and the puffin's name was Paul. Mrs. Ticklefeather and Paul were very fond of each other. There was just one other thing that Mrs. Ticklefeather was fond of. She was fond of sunflowers. "Oh, Paul," said Mrs. Ticklefeather every day, "how I wish I had a beautiful sunflower to put in this big vase." One night, thin old Mrs. Ticklefeather and Paul went to bed, and just before they went to sleep, Mrs. Ticklefeather said, "Paul, do you think I am ever going to be lucky enough to have a sunflower?" And Paul said, "Good night, dear Mrs. Ticklefeather. I wouldn't be surprised if you had one much sooner than you think." The next morning, when Mrs. Ticklefeather woke up, there was no Paul standing on the bottom of the bed. Mrs. Ticklefeather called, "Paul, Paul, where are you?" But no Paul answered. Then Mrs. Ticklefeather began to cry, and she said, "Paul, my dear Paul, come back to me." But no Paul came. So Mrs. Ticklefeather picked up the telephone and she said, "I want a policeman. This is Mrs. Ticklefeather. Please send me a policeman quickly, quickly, quickly." Soon there was a policeman standing inside the door. "Oh, policeman," said Mrs. Ticklefeather, "my darling sweet Puffin Paul is lost." "Lend me a laundry bag," said the policeman, "and lend me a long stick. Maybe an apple picker would do." Away went the policeman to look for Paul, and before many minutes he saw a steam engine sitting on the tracks. The policeman looked all around the engine, but there was no Puffin. Yet he did find one thing that surprised him very much. "Engineer," he said, "do you mean to have a pillow lying on your cowcatcher?" And the engineer said, "Gracious, no!" So the policeman popped the pillow into the laundry bag and he walked away. After a little while, he came to a school. He looked all around the school and there was no Puffin, but he did find one thing that surprised him. He found a frog sitting on the teacher's shoulders. So he said, "Teacher, this frog surprises me very much. Do you mean to have a frog on your shoulder?" And the teacher said, "Gracious, no!" So the policeman popped the frog into the laundry bag with the pillow and walked away. All of a sudden, the policeman saw a man walking with a box on a wheelbarrow. The policeman said, "Sir, what do you have in the box of yours?" And the man said, "It's empty." So the policeman said, "What did you have in the box before it was empty?" And the man said, "A turtle." Then the policeman looked in and saw a feather lying on the bottom of the box. It was a puffin's feather. So he said, "You wicked man, you may need to be arrested. You know perfectly well that turtles have no feathers. So what is that feather doing in your box?" The man was so frightened that he said, "Well, all right, it was a puffin." And the policeman said, "Wicked, horrible man, the puffin is not here now. Where is he?" "Oh, policeman," said the man, "please don't arrest me. All I did was sell him to Mr. Macaroni for his birthday dinner." "And where does Mr. Macaroni live?" said the policeman. "In that house there," said the man with the wheelbarrow. So the policeman ran to Mr. Macaroni's house, and there was Paul lying on the table looking very sad, and there was Mr. Macaroni lifting up a sharp axe. In 1 second the sharp axe was going to chop off Paul's head. And the interesting thing was that all the while poor sad Paul was lying on the table, he was holding a beautiful sunflower in his beak. "Stop, stop," said the policeman. "Don't cut off Paul's head. You don't really want a puffin for your birthday dinner. Stop, and I will get you something much more delicious." The policeman ran out of the house, and he ran as quickly as he could to a store, and he said, "What is the most delicious thing in your store?" And everybody in the store said, "This fish." So the policeman bought the fish. He ran back and gave the fish to Mr. Macaroni, and he said, "Here, you will like this much better than a puffin. It has a much better taste, and anyway, you are too hungry for one puffin. It would be different if you were planning to eat 3 puffins, or even 2 puffins. Then I would not say a word. But as it is, I am glad you have changed your mind. So goodbye, Mr. Macaroni." Then the policeman started running, and he ran as fast as the wind, and Paul started flying. And he flew as fast as the wind, too. Soon they were home again, and Mrs. Ticklefeather said, "Oh, my darling Paul, I am so glad to see you. It is no fun at all living without you." And Paul said, "Darling Mrs. Ticklefeather, I went to get a sunflower for you, and here it is." At last, Mrs. Ticklefeather and Paul were all alone. "That was kind of you to give the policeman our laundry bag and our apple picker for a present," said Paul. Mrs. Ticklefeather put her arm around Paul, and she gave him a tight squeeze, and she said, "Oh, what a lucky, lucky, lucky lady I am." The end.